I imagine most of the types of founders that you guys are dealing with are also software developers. They're like,
Yes.
they're software developer nerds that are like, hey, we can build this cool thing, we can innovate, but they are not sales and marketing people. They are not go-to-market strategy people. They are terrible at it, which was me. That was me.
Yeah,
Like, I
well,
get
and
it,
same, hard same,
right?
right? And so, yeah, the way I kind of try to put it tersely is like almost all of our founders are these just like brilliant, like you put like
Nerds.
engineers, product people, and they have this clear, crisp vision of some better future that should exist for other technical practitioners, and to like create some new category or redefine an existing category in some fundamental new way. But yeah, their commercial instincts, much like yours at that stage in your career, mine at that stage in the career, are not just like wrong or naive, but in many cases like actively harmful, right?
Right.
To scaling like a big business.
And we're back for another episode of the Startup Hustle. This is your host, Matt Watson. I think we're going to geek out a little bit today. I'm very excited. Our guest today is Joseph Ruscio. He's one of the founders at a VC company called Heavybit that specializes in helping software development related companies, like people that are building technology that is sold to software developers. So it's kind of a niche sort of boutique sort of VC fund. But they have an interesting perspective on how AI may change the world. And I think we're going to have a fun conversation about AI and software development today. Before we get started, I do want to remind everybody today's episode is brought to you by Fullscale, which is my company. If you're looking to hire software developers, front end, back end, mobile, QA, whatever it is you need, we charge on average about $5,000 or $6,000 a month for a full-time software developer. You can check us out at fullscale.io. Welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, well, hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
And also interesting that both of us were founders of companies that I guess were competed with each other, that were
Yeah,
in the APM, observability, application monitoring space, 5-10 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, some serendipity. As we were talking in the pre-show, my background, I've been a partner and investor at Heavybit for about just over 6 years now, which is kind of wild to think about. But yeah, prior to that, I had spent the better part of 20 years as a technologist turned serial entrepreneur like yourself. And in the late aughts or whatever, I got real excited about cloud computing and what I thought that and continuous delivery practices were going to do for software developers like ourselves. And yeah, I ended up founding one of the very first cloud native observability monitoring companies for cloud infrastructure. So I think in the broad sense that like all monitoring data ultimately kind of wants to live together, we were probably starting to compete from different areas.
I always described it as like we were the black box on an airplane. It's like we collect all the data and
Yep.
This thing's going to crash. Hopefully not. But if it crashes, we got all the data and help the developers figure out what's going on, right? It's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. Well, I think I always tell people when Google published the SRE, the Site Reliability Engineering book, now some number of years ago, there's a great hierarchy of needs in there. And the very bottom layer is monitoring observability. Because if you don't know what's going on, you can't fix it. Right?
You can't fix it if you can't measure it.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm super excited to talk about AI, and I know your company has invested in 4 different AI companies lately, and everybody's got these different opinions and perspectives about how AI is going to radically change software development. But before we get into that, I'd love to talk a little more about Heavybit and what you guys do, and what's kind of unique and different about having a VC firm like yours that's like very hyper specific on like investing in specific kind of companies.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's interesting and, part of my path into venture is that, I was part of my very first, as a startup founder, I was part of my very first venture-backed financing in 2004, I think, for summer 2004, we were pitching and raising. And then was, part of that process a number of times, I think 4 or 5 total different times I was raising, money for a company. Probably in total have raised, north of, $50 million or something, which, in ZERP time frame maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but was certainly a lot, back
It's
then.
an insane amount of money.
Yeah.
Even today, that's a lot of money.
Right. Fair enough. And yeah, one of the things that's always fascinated me is just like how quickly venture as a practice, art, science has evolved over that time period. And one of the things that's happened, I believe, and part of the reason I'm at a firm like Heavybit is, whereas 20 something years ago there was a very small number of firms that were all generalists with a primary skill and value the kind of partnership brought was literally just access to capital, which was a scarce resource for entrepreneurs like ourselves back then. Now there are thousands of firms. Capital, I don't ever want to like make it sound trite, like so it's easy to go raise money, but capital is not scarce now. It's the best companies to put it into. And so I think what you're seeing, is you can think of it as an industrialization or systemization of venture. This in some ways similar to the same way other parts of the finance asset classes have done that. And so moving forward, if you're a world-class entrepreneur, founder, and you have your choice of what venture firm you want to work with, the money is almost like the least important part, right? It's like, what is that firm bringing in terms of their expertise? How can they, founders, particularly as a former founder, like I'm obviously a firm believer, like founders own all outcomes of a company, successes, failures. They're the only ones who can succeed. But as an investor, I think of myself as like a good coach or manager in a professional sport. Like my job is to help put that founder in the best possible position for them to win.
Well, I think what you're saying is we're seeing more and more specialty, right? Like,
yeah, specialization.
You guys are specialized in investing in companies that do sort of DevOps, developer related sort of stuff, right? And,
infrastructure, yeah.
And I know somebody else has a fund that only invests in like automotive software, and
or like fintech.
Yeah. Clearly, there's people that only invest in like home service companies, only invest in plumbers, right? We got a lot of specialty, but I think the question is, and to get your point is, do you guys and do other funds actually provide value besides the money? Right? If you only provide the money, like you're saying, like it doesn't really matter who you get the money from. It's like, but a lot of VCs, do they really provide the extra value?
Yeah, and I think the answer is they should. And I think the answer is it varies, right?
They say they do.
Right. Oh, everyone, yeah, and 100%, everyone says they do, and they should. But I think, as a founder, it's just, you need to look a little closer, a little under the hood and say, okay, when they say value, what actually do they mean? And there's just different variants of that. What we bring at Heavybit, which I think is incredibly important, and the most important, I think, particularly for early stage companies, right? Because there's also stage appropriateness, right? And like what a company needs when they're at a, $50 million run rate and driving towards $100 million, maybe it's more quantitative. We invest at the earliest stage, right? Like we invest when founders are incorporating their companies.
Okay.
We invest at pre-seed and seed. Almost always pre-revenue, often pre-product, right?
Wow.
And so
you guys are
big
risk takers.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And in that case, we like to say, and especially, we invest in B2B infrastructure, and that is what we call like path dependent, where like small choices, and I'm sure you can reflect back in your journey as an entrepreneur, like small choices in the earliest days of a company often can have compounding, almost butterfly effects as the company scales out and gets bigger and bigger. And so a thing we kind of pride ourselves on by having that sector focus, by working with many different companies, selling to the same kind of markets with the same kind of value props, is helping founders avoid mistakes and helping founders optimize outcomes at those earliest path dependent moments.
Well, and I think you guys probably uniquely more than a lot can provide a ton of value, because I imagine most of the types of founders that you guys are dealing with are also software developers. They're like,
yes.
They're software developer nerds that are like, hey, we can build this cool thing, we can innovate, we can do this weird thing with server monitoring or infrastructure or whatever, but they are not sales and marketing people. They are not go-to-market strategy people. They are terrible at it, which was me. That was me.
Yeah,
like I get it.
Same. Hard same, right? And so, yeah, the way I kind of try to put it tersely is like, almost all of our founders are these just like brilliant, like you put
nerds,
like engineers, product people, and they have this clear, crisp vision of some better future that should exist for other technical practitioners, and to like create some new category or redefine an existing category in some fundamental new way. But yeah, their commercial instincts, much like yours at that stage in your career, mine at that stage in the career, are not just like wrong or naive, but in many cases like actively harmful. right?
Right.
To scaling like a big business. And
It's super difficult to sell most of these kinds of products. And that was the problem that I had going into it. My previous business, we grew to like 30 million a year in revenue, all via telephone, over the phone, like calling people up and like doing sales over the phone. And then you get into this and like, okay, we're trying to sell to software developers. They clearly don't answer the phone. They don't answer email. They all use ad blockers. They don't want to talk to anybody. Like, how do you sell to these people? Like, this is terrible. Like, they are literally the worst people in the world to sell something to.
Yeah.
And if you guys have that playbook, right? You have the playbook of like, hey, we have all these portfolio companies. We've done all this. We get it. If you can help give that playbook to the people that come in, like that is an incredibly valuable thing. That's where VCs, like they say they should provide a lot of value. And if you guys actually do it, it's like, it is really valuable.
Yeah, look, and that was the founding thesis behind the firm was that one, software developers were, the whole, to quote the Red Monk people, like, developers are the new kingmakers. And most importantly, I always point out like the combination of cloud computing, like ephemeral compute, and continuous delivery practices meant where historically the like single blocking factor for any business to get new business requirements into working code was something like, oh, we got to wait on procuring a server, we got to wait on a release to be approved by security. Now the single blocking factor is how fast developer velocity, right? How fast can developers move?
Yeah.
And so in that world, it's really, really important. And so our firm was based on that. And then the second is that there's a best practice way to bring these products to market. To your point that developers are a very specific and very particular kind of audience, which the vast majority of the existing venture community and MBA CEOs and whatever just fundamentally did not understand. And I think we'll tie into when we talk about AI later, still today do not understand actually what it means to build and operate software.
Well, let me ask you this. So do you guys also have the kind of relations where you can help walk them in and make, really warm intros to some of their first clients?
Oh yeah, 100%, right? I mean, we have a large network in which grows every year of CXOs, whether it's your CISO or your CTO or your CIO, just in terms of like even just like our other portfolio companies. So yeah, helping people like reach their first design partners, understand what success looks like there. I have to like a company, these kind of companies, first you have to find product market fit, which is part of what you're talking about there. Yeah. And then you have to find go-to-market fit, right? Which is, and that's not just like distribution model, whether that's like, bottom up or top down, but then like, who's the ICP? How do you message them? Like solving that for a scalable, like, oh, we know how to identify our ICP at scale. We know the words and the totems that if we say to them, they'll understand what we do. And that's really, really hard. Like, I think second, there's this truism which I subscribe to where it's like, first time founders care about product, second time founders care about distribution because it turns out that's really the hard part. So yeah, we spend a lot of time there.
Man, I preach this all the time on LinkedIn and all this stuff, and you're 100% right. It's all about distribution. And if you guys can help developers who are building these kind of products understand and shortcut that puts them way ahead. So I think, the point of this conversation is like, I think the value in kind of a niche, boutique-y, I don't know what the right terminology is for like what you guys do, is extremely valuable because if I went to anybody else, they wouldn't understand this kind of business. They wouldn't understand like how to sell it. They wouldn't necessarily know who those first customers are and how to attack them, how to win enterprise deals like this way. Like you guys understanding that market and being able to give that playbook to these companies in your fund is so valuable. And so I think what you guys are doing is absolutely fantastic. And I don't know if it's Stackify, we ever reached out to you guys or not, but yeah, I mean, like would have been the perfect kind of partner.
Yeah, I mean, early days. And I think just in general in venture, I think it was Mark Andreessen. It's a few years ago at this point, but, put something out where their belief, and I subscribe to this, where venture is kind of, like I said, industrialized into where you'll have the big mega multi-stage brand name firms, which I think are great for your later rounds. And then you'll have boutique sector specific firms for the exact reasons you said. And if I was ever starting a company at the earliest stage, I would want an ex-operator with what I was doing. 1,000,000%, like, because it short circuits so much, right? Like you just get to get right to what is the strategic problem we have to solve today, And for an early stage entrepreneur, it's a different one. Like it feels like every day sometimes, right?
Yeah, and if you guys have that industry expertise, you understand, like, okay, does the enterprise have this problem, and does this really serve a need for them? Like, you guys get the market. So I'd love to talk about AI, and, I've been a software developer for 25 years, owner of Full Scale. We have 300 software developers, and people always ask me, tell me, like, you guys are going out of business. AI is going to replace all the software developers. You guys are doomed. It's end of days, whatever, right? And I'm like sitting here today, and I'm like, I don't know. It feels like developers have more work than they've ever had to do before. And I was talking to a founder the other day about this topic, and I'm like, hey, by the way, are all your customers asking you for all this like AI functionality, like investors? Everybody's putting all this pressure on you to build all this AI crap. But do you actually have time and resources to go do that? Because you had all this other roadmap stuff to do. Like, you have more work to do than you did before. And by the way, are your customers actually going to pay more money for this AI stuff, or does it just sound really good in marketing and you're building it for that? Like, I think it's putting a lot of stress, I think, on a lot of product teams, right? Of like, we got to do some AI related thing, but are we really going to get anything out of it? Does it really improve our product, or does it just sound good? Like, but we got to keep up with the hype and ride the train, right? It's like a whole mess out there, I feel like.
Oh, totally. Yeah, man, there's a lot there. Like, I do think, for instance, the AI pressure is real. I mean, a fascinating thing to me as someone like yourself who's been now through like a number of these like platform shift cycles in the industry, and then someone as a student of the history of IT industry that predates my personal experience. I think this is fairly unique in how immediate the acceptance is. If I think about things like, for instance, cloud computing and like many things before, there's this period of time where people at the frontier are excited, but the late majority, if you take your crossing the chasm kind of language, is very dismissive, and they're like, oh man, cloud service, no one's gonna put things into production on fake virtual machines. I remember that with VMware first, and then, well, no enterprise is gonna trust Amazon like a bookstore with their compute workloads, right? And so there's this period of time where at the frontier you can kind of innovate and figure it out.
Well, and I've had some great founders on the podcast that were doing something before ChatGPT came out. So like 2021, 2022. Yeah. They were already doing something kind of AI related. And, this is a story of like Jasper and stuff, right? Like they were trying to do this kind of stuff. Then ChatGPT came out, and they were able to use that to upgrade the technology. So it's like what they were trying to do like sort of worked, and then all of a sudden adding the new large language models made it like really work. And they just took off like gangbusters, right? But it was the ones that were working on it before that when it came out were able to quickly adopt it, that really, really took off, right? Like the ones now are still like kind of behind. They're like, we've been engineering this thing for 12 months, 18 months. Trying to build a whole business, build a whole product, get it off the ground, right? Like we're still seeing a lot of people that are still in R&D on probably a lot of different things.
Yeah, well, we're still, it's wild in some respect, especially kind of, in the circles that you or I travel in, probably online and in person. It's just so endemic and saturated. Everyone's focused on it. But I do like to periodically remind myself that we are still in kind of in something like the earliest of days in really understanding like what this is going to be really good at, and what it's not going to be great at, and where the value is even going to accrue. And so I think, and there's lots of, and I have my own theories there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, you mentioned even coming back to software engineering. I mean, one of my perspectives, because as you hear that, I mean, you might imagine we hear the same thing, like as a venture firm that focuses on infrastructure for developers. I mean, we've had potential investors in our firm say, well, if there's no more developers, like people don't need the companies you invest in anymore, right? And I understand naively where that question comes from, but I usually kind of mentally note, I'm like, oh, tell me you've never developed software without telling me you've never developed software, right?
That's always what I think.
Yeah, it's kind of a big tell. And yeah, because I come back and I say, look, okay, again, going back to the whole history of IT, every time we've introduced some like new productivity leap forward, whether it's going from assembly to higher level languages, or introducing memory management, right, to or memory safety now with stuff like Rust, every time we introduce some new productivity, the only thing we do is we raise and expand the ambition of what we want to do with software, right? Like no one's ever said, "Oh, good, we've solved software.
Now we can
stop."
build self-driving cars. Now we can build
Yeah,
robots.
right.
Now we can
Yeah,
do
it's
whatever.
just it's always more and more and more.
Yeah.
And it's always like, okay, how much leverage? I mean, if you look at what the typical software engineer can produce versus a software engineer 40 years ago, even though probably 40 years ago that a software engineer was like more technically adept and trained because of like what you had to do to become a software engineer.
You had to be a super nerd then.
You're right, yeah, and but it's not even close. Like today's software engineers are so much more productive, just because of all the innovation we've had. So I look at AI as just yet another one which is going to make good software engineers, even more valuable than they already are, and it's going to make more people software engineers than could have been before. And we're just gonna. It's hard for me to conceive of a world where its appetite for software goes down.
Well, the hardest part about software is figuring out what are we going to build, why are we going to build it, how are we going to build it, the requirements. Like you ask any developer, they'll tell you that their challenges, the requirements are like one sentence on a Jira card, and they're like, I don't even know exactly what to do. And then I work on something and I get it done, and it wasn't the right way, and we go back and forth. So if that's the case, if all the AI is going to get to know is the one sentence on the Jira card, how is it going to do?
Yeah, no, that is, I mean, yeah, if you get into the specific, I've seen some, I'm trying to think, pretty pithy where it's like, oh, we're going to be able to do software now in a completely, non-deterministic specific language like English. Now you have two problems, right? Like, I think that's fair. Well, and I think what people, and even a lot of the examples, because what these models can clearly do is why, in terms of certainly removing toil, right? Like, I mean, even just in terms of like, okay, previously where you would have had to go and Google something and find it on Stack Overflow and copy and paste it, and now the Copilot just kind of spits that out for you. Great.
Yeah.
The thing where you can ask it. I was one of my old colleagues. We were in like a group chat, and they just the other day posted in. They were like, "Oh, here's this like just awful 1,000-line JavaScript function at my work," and I popped it into O1 and asked it to like analyze the problems, and here's all the stuff it came back with. Like, things where I think it's really good and amazing. A couple areas. One is to that stuff, just removing and reducing toil. Right, like the stuff where it's like it's not like a ton of value to the overall process of like figuring out what to build, figuring out what to optimize for, figuring out how to scale it. Just like, okay, now that we know all that stuff, just turning the crank. It's really, really good at, which I think is important, reducing the activation energy to go try something new. Right, like the classic thing is like, oh well, what if we could build this feature? Could someone go spike that out? Right, and it's like, don't have enough time. If your AI, if your Copilot can generate like 80% of, it doesn't work, but it's like 80% of the way there or whatever, but that gets you over the activation energy. It's like, okay, well, I can bang on that and we can see if it works. Like more experiments are going to get run, more kind of wild ideas will get tried, and that's, I mean, part of what going back to making like continuous delivery, like reducing the cost of change, for me is like the fundamental aspect of developer velocity. And so I think this is just going to be another big reduction in cost of change, just at a different place than we've ever reduced it before, right? Usually we've been reducing it in like the verification and delivery. Now we're going to reduce the cost of change in the kind of developer further left, right? And so I think that's super exciting. But yeah, I mean, I was, sorry, go ahead.
So tell me about the companies you guys have invested in. You told me before that you recently invested in 4 different companies. Can you share what some of those companies are doing?
Yeah, happy to. So one of them is actually interesting. It's kind of like the example you brought up with Jasper, where this was a team. The company's called Kubiya, Kubiya, and they are a basically DevOps teammate.
Okay.
And so it's a teammate. It sits in your Slack, and you can basically give it tasks. If you're like a sales engineer and you need a new demo environment set up, right? You can say, hey, Kubiya, can you stand me up a demo environment? And it knows how to go, like basically what Terraform commands to run, what AWS commands to run. and also how to verify. Importantly, very importantly, the team has a big focus on making your AI
security.
Yeah, your AI teammate reliable, repeatable. And so, right now, the founder probably wouldn't like me to say it this way, but I think it's true. It's like it's a great DevOps intern that there's a set of tasks you can basically 100% trust it to do, and we're gonna like raise that level up over time. But the point is like DevOps professionals, SREs, should not be wasting time sitting around waiting for AWS command lines to run and verifying that they ran correctly and that the resources are there. And like anyone who's used cloud has done this, right?
Yeah.
And they're interesting because...
And some of these are really only problems at certain types of scale, right? Like,
yes,
my last startup, my deployment pipeline was logging into Azure, click, select GitHub repo, click, done. Never looked at it again, right? But that's totally different than like some big enterprise and it deploys on hundreds of servers and you got red, green deployments and rolling deployments and like massive scale. Like some of these kinds of problems that like your portfolio companies are trying to solve are like big enterprise problems. And some of them are more, universal, simpler problems. The thing is, some of these things just have very niche problem sets they're trying to solve. Yeah,
and this one is a great example like you used of Jasper where they were working in this problem domain with a bunch of like NLP expertise pre the ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
And so it was like, I think pretty intelligently, like once that came out, they were like, oh, here's a much more powerful primitive that we can put in here that will accelerate our kind of focus here. And so they just launched into it's in the last month. So, people are interested, they should check that out. Another company we backed is called Continue.dev, which is a open source project, which is basically Copilot pluggable developer Copilot ergonomics. So like a big thesis we have as a firm and have since really day one, going back 2 years ago when ChatGPT launched and we all started to consider like, what's the world going to look like given how powerful this is? We think there's going to be a number of foundation models like there already are. We've always felt, and really has been coming true more and more, that there would be available, so what people now call open weight models, right? Like Llama, Mistral. But that, if you put yourself in the shoes of an enterprise, there are surely lots and lots of use cases where, if you're given a choice between like, okay, well, am I going to call out some inference API and some foundation model, some black box with my data, or I have something running on-prem, which is like 80%, 90% is accurate.
Yeah.
But I can tune inference cost. I don't have any data provenance issues. Like I can plan around. That's like so we think long-term there's like a non-trivial amount of inference will be in the enterprise.
We're going to need a lot more smaller models, right? Like the previous company you talked about, they just need a model that understands like all those DevOps commands and all that command line.
Yeah.
They don't need that model so you can also go ask it about law, right?
Yeah,
like, they need a really simplified model.
Yeah, and they don't need a model that can generate short films or whatever, right?
No.
Like, so... Yeah,
they need a really lightweight, simple, simpler model that potentially could run on their own infrastructure, and it's not that expensive to run.
100%, yeah, and you can control all that, and so and then it follows from that well, in that case, for your exact point, like the more endemic this becomes, the more it makes sense for different use cases for there to be different models with different fine tunings and different RAG setups and whatever.
I want the one with the best dad jokes.
Yeah,
that's the one I want.
But if you're an enterprise now, and this comes back to Continue, if you're an enterprise that's using some mix of foundation models, on-prem models, different tunings, you probably still want your developers to have a normalized experience so they can drop into wherever code they need to and work the same way. And that's where Continue comes in, where it's this, like I said, open source. You can bring your own model, you can hook it to a foundation model. It's really popular for, I think, good reason. And it's interesting. I mean, you think of there's your like Devons, which is your like fully automated. There's Cursor is kind of pretty hyped right now, which is like this VS Code fork that ties back to Claude, and they're like another angle approach on how to do that. And I think I do firmly believe at some point, every single developer is going to have a Copilot of some kind, so it's going to be a big market. But we think a big chunk of the market is going to need something like Continue. What else? I'm trying to think. Some of them are like in stealth and very early. But we have one company that's actually working kind of very specifically at the core level of code generation and augmenting these some of these open weight models. With the belief, going to what you were saying, that we can have like a pretty thin, lightweight model for specific kinds of programming tasks, that for engineers, because often you have front end engineers, you have back end engineers, you have JavaScript engineers, Golang engineers.
Yeah.
I think there will be some highly specialized tools, and it's not going to be one foundation model to rule them all. So we have a startup very early doing a lot of exploration in that area. We have another one we just backed that's doing an exploration on using these models to like synthesize institutional engineering knowledge. The kind of stuff that walks out the door when somebody leaves a company. And so, I think there's a lot of categories that would be in one of them, where there's been a number of, I think YC kind of refers to these as tar pits. I like to say it's a category where there's two kinds of companies, new ones and dead ones, where it's been like historically pretty resistant to a business actually coming up with a horizontal solution.
Okay.
And I think a lot of times in those categories, or an interesting question, which we're trying to prove out, because look, as an early stage venture firm, like we're supposed to take some, like you said, high risk, high beta bets and see if they can work out. Is this a category where previous solutions have failed because they're just too rigid? It requires too much conformity on the end user. It can't handle quite enough weird edge cases, because the real world, synthetic demos are great, but the real world is just like messy.
It's like a self-driving car.
Right.
Sounds easy until the kid runs out in front of the car.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Same problem. So we have a general thesis that some of these categories may, for the first time, where the value prop is obvious, it just hasn't been possible, but that the generative AI models might be the missing piece of flexibility to make that category work.
So talk to me more about, like, Devin and Cursor are good examples right now that have raised, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars or something, like stupid amounts of money. They're both supposed to, either like sort of pseudo replace a developer, or like really be the next level, like, of code complete assistant, like to another level. And I'm curious your take on how these companies manage to raise like $100 million, yet they have no product. They're like pre-revenue, whatever. Like, as a VC partner, like, does that like, what do you think of when you hear that?
Yeah.
It's like a massive bet.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple pieces to that. One is a thing to keep in mind, because in a lot of valuations in AI, it's like, looking back in the zero interest rate era, right? It was clear, particularly late 2020 through 2021, venture got a little unhinged. And in part, it was because public equity valuations were a little unhinged, right? And it kind of like works its way down the system. In most of venture, that's kind of reset, except AI is this kind of interesting area where, because of the belief about its potential, some of that irrational exuberance is still there. But I think specifically to your question, what you have to consider, because when I talk to a lot of founders, I'm like, okay, AI, this is great, but like, this still, every business there's like this fundamental law of business physics where your product provides a return on investment, and you get to capture a subset of that return on investment, right? And what's interesting about AI is, rightly or wrongly, for many of these products, the theoretical return on investment is you don't pay humans anymore, right? Yeah. This goes back to the if the robots are going to write all the software. So if your blue sky is that like, it's
like the robo-taxi.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So like you employ 300 software engineers or something, right, at your company. So if I say, hey, take that headcount budget, and you just have to spend some of that on, like, you don't have to spend that at all, just a subset of that on my robot engineer, I can command a pretty high premium, what you could justify paying me. So I think, rightly or wrongly, and I would argue the closer you get to the limit, much more wrongly, that's what's underwriting some of these investments, is the blue sky high beta risk is that we get to take half of Matt's headcount budget, right? Which is a big number.
But but here's part of my concern with this too is, so obviously I have 300 employees in the Philippines, and if I told you today that software development is expensive, what is your immediate reaction to that?
Yeah, my reaction is it is. My reaction is it's both in, yeah, it's a complicated topic. In some ways, it's unnaturally expensive, right? And but also like the leverage you get out of software in your business is so massive. I think software engineering hours are, and for most companies, actually the most precious resource they have.
They are.
Right? Because the margin, the return you can get on those, if you're doing it right. And this is where I think most companies where most companies are like, oh, this is too expensive. It's because, well, you're not actually really doing it right. And so the return you're getting for all the software engineering hours you're spending is not nearly as high as it should be.
So I asked ChatGPT today to rank by country around the world, how many developers are in each country, and on average, how much the developers make in each of those countries.
Mm-hmm.
And then I asked it, across all of that, what percentage of software developers in the world make less than $30,000 a year? What do you think the number was?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm sure those numbers are raising every year. I mean, just as the total amount of global software developers go up, and you compare those economies, is it 30%?
95%.
95%.
So most people don't realize 90% of software developers are not in the United States.
Right.
There are like 5 million in China, 5 million in India, a lot in Bangladesh, Philippines, all these different places, and most of those developers make $2,000 to $3,000 a month. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, a friend of mine hired a developer this week from Pakistan for $1,100 a month. Right? Like, software development doesn't have to be expensive, right? Like,
oh no,
but
yeah,
that's what's interesting about the balance of this is, there's companies like Netflix that pay hundreds of thousands of dollars per developer, and then there's my friend who pays $1,100 a month for in Pakistan.
Yeah, well,
so the cost of software development is all over the place.
Yeah, well, the whole thing. I mean, it comes back to one of the challenges. I just think as an industry, we're just still really not good for the most part, at the general management of software engineering teams.
That's the problem.
Yeah, 100%.
It's that.
Yeah.
What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it? The requirements, all of that part of it is very, very difficult, right? And if you look at the different studies, most developers spend 20% of their day writing code. Maybe if it's a lot, it's 30, 40, 50% of their time. They spend a lot of time, in meetings, documentation, reading code, looking at requirements, planning, deployments, all these other tasks, right? So if you only spend 20% of your time writing code, and let's say AI makes you 50% more efficient at that, like that's still just a smaller part of your job compared to all these other things. Like, unless AI replaces all those other things, I don't see how it makes a tremendous dent.
Well, and look, I think some of those other things you listed, it can help with, like in terms of like, instead of having to completely read the docs, asking it like where in the docs, or like, I think, and again, that's where I kind of view it as potentially really valuable. Like for me, there's kind of, very broadly speaking, you can think about these solutions in two buckets. One that attempts to replace humans, and one that gives humans superpowers.
Yeah.
Right?
Takes away the toil.
Makes you faster, like makes you more accurate, catches mistakes. And for me, that I think is where, I just think like senior software engineers, again, if you zoom out, it's like, oh, what we're going to do is dramatically increase your productivity and your leverage. And it's like, oh, well, then what the business gets out of me, like you look at your Netflixes and your Googles and the kind of preposterous total compensation that they give senior software engineers, they're going to be able to justify even more than that once we've kind of figured out all the best practices and how to like really turbocharge these people with their assistants or team, whatever you want to call it. And so that's, for me, I think it's actually, it's funny because people are like, oh, doom and gloom. I'm like, I think this is a very bull signal. Like, and yes, if you're someone right now who, as a software developer, makes all of your kind of income on Upwork or Fiverr setting up WordPress sites, that's probably going to go away. If you're a software developer working on innovation, in a large company, I think as long as you're tooling up on how to use these things, I think you're going to be fine and probably much happier, honestly, in the future. Like, less toil.
So I was thinking about this earlier. We were having this conversation. The analogy about the WordPress stuff is actually an interesting one, because setting up a WordPress website is actually very easy these days. And there are visual designers for all of this stuff, like Elementor and Show It and all these things that actually make it really easy to like point, click, build a website. You don't need to know HTML in any way, shape, or form. But yet people still don't know how to do it because they don't know how to use those tools, right? Like they don't know how to use the tools. They're not experts in it, or they're not designers. They don't know what good looks like or how to style things.
Well, that's a whole other problem, but yes.
Right? But it's the same challenge with like building software is kind of the point. Like, it's like, I know we need to build a website, a software is kind of like saying, I know I need to build a website, but I don't know the details. I don't know the requirements. I don't know the design. I don't want to learn to use the tools. Even if the tools become easier and easier to use, like Elementor as an example on the WordPress side is really easy to use, but people still don't know how to use it. There's training for it, all that kind of stuff. You still have to hire somebody to do it that has expertise in how to do it. Like, it didn't completely replace them.
Well, and I think what a lot of will be interesting to see how LLMs change is, for me at least historically, because these notion of these no-code things has been around for a while, and there's been a bunch of versions. We've always kind of shied away really from investing in them because they're like great for getting people started, but in my experience, it's like as soon as the closer you get to doing something of real unique value, the less likely like the pre-existing whatever the no-code lets you do. Because part of what you get for the no-code is you trade off going back to flexibility. You give up flexibility.
Or cost somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And so right when like, oh, this is starting to get interesting, that's when I really need to start like customizing and I can't. And so where I am, it'll be interesting to see, because LLMs have this iterative kind of flexibility, is how much further they can take that paradigm, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot farther. I don't know how far exactly, but farther than certainly the kind of like WYSIWYG no-code things could do.
But that said, Microsoft Access has existed for like 25 years to build software, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, fair.
And we're still going.
Yeah.
And we're still going.
I mean, Visual Basic is one of the most productive software development platforms of all time, right? By any kind of reasonable measure. That's what I started learning. That's what I did 25 years ago, Visual Basic. Yeah. I was a Visual Beginner's all-purpose symbolic construction code developer. Nice, yeah.
Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. It's like a very interesting conversation. Interesting that we have, some similar backgrounds. I think the type of boutique sort of VC fund that you guys are is absolutely awesome. And, if somebody's looking for investors, of course, if you guys are a fit, you guys would be perfect. But I think the point is like looking for other boutique sort of funds that really specialize in what you do. Like you said, fintech or martech or be it automotive or whatever it is, is really good.
Yeah, I mean, my advice certainly if you're doing infrastructure, developer tools, DevSecOps, security, you should definitely come talk to us and other people like us. But ultimately, like, you should find your tribe. Like, it's so hard. It's so hard in the earliest days of founding a company, going from 0 to 1. Not even getting to founder mode, but like that's my kind of definition of founder mode is actually 0 to 1. It's so hard, like finding people who not just can like back you with capital, but actually, understand what you're going through and can help. I think is. So I would tell anybody, find your domain, find the experts there, and go see if you can find a bunch of other dimensions you have to fit with a VC on, but like go see if you have those other fit.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this today. Again, this was Joseph Ruscio from Heavybit, one of the partners there. It's heavybit.com. You guys have invested in some big name companies that a lot of people know. So hopefully you guys made out pretty good in some of those had some big wins. So
yeah, we've been very fortunate. Circle CI, Launch Darkly, Sneak, Netlify, Tailscale more recently. We've been very fortunate to work with some just like amazing entrepreneurs and constantly on the lookout for the next one.
All right.
So always happy to talk shop.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this today.
Yep. Bye, Matt.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Take care.